Good afternoon. My name is Joanna Page, and as director of CRASSH, I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all to this much anticipated event, a highlight of our programme this year. So CRASSH stands for the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, and our mission is to promote innovative work across and beyond those disciplines. Our centre's rather violent name does make it sound as though we like to move fast and break things. And sometimes we do. And that is one form of innovating, but of course there are many forms of innovation. Like making surprising connections between that challenge what we think that we knew, finding forms of critique and resistance in unexpected places, mapping out new practices, or perhaps showing us that they're not so very new after all, and defying the norms of and the conventions of academic writing. And we find all of those qualities and many more in the work of Professor Jack Halberstam, who we're delighted to welcome as our speaker today. So in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Leila Mukida, who's Associate Professor of Modern German Studies, who's going to give a fuller introduction to the work of Jack. But before that, I wanted to give my thanks, a few thanks to a few people. Firstly, to Leila, whose idea this was. Secondly, to Dr. Lauren Wilcox from the Centre for Gender Studies, and both of them have helped to organise Jack's visit. And to the wonderful team at CRASSH who have made this happen. Thank you all, but mostly, of course, thanks to Jack for accepting our invitation to give this lecture, which we're looking forward to immensely. Leila, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this CRASSH annual lecture with Professor Jack Halberstam, David Feinson Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. It's no exaggeration to say that Jack is a thinker whose work is field-defining. Throughout his career, the gendered body has been taken as the nexus for wide and far-reaching interventions on, or simply put, the things that matter. Across his 7 monographs, objects of inquiry have included Gothic fiction, low and high-budget Gothic horror films, 1990s drag king culture, historical transgender figures, lesbian punk, children's animation, Lady Gaga, Lego, falconry, architecture, literary modernism. In Skin Show's Gothic horror and the technology of monsters from 1995, Jack moves from 19th century Gothic monsters to the monsters of contemporary horror films, arguing that the Gothic monster offers answers to the question of who must be removed from the community at large. The monster, according to Jack, produces the deviant subjectivities opposite which the normal, the healthy, and the pure can be known. In Jack's 3rd book, In a Queer Time and Place from 2005, he makes the bold claim that there is such a thing as queer time and queer space. The ideas in this book have been hugely influential. The idea of queer temporality is synonymous with Jack's name. His insistence that queer time is not only about compression and annihilation as it emerges from the AIDS crisis, but is also about the potentiality of a life unscripted by the conventions of family, inheritance, and child rearing, has proven hugely generative across the arts and social sciences. Jack's work in this book on the transgender gaze builds on one of the most foundational theories of film, Laura Mulvey's classic feminist essay on the pleasure of looking in narrative cinema. With reference to Brandon Teener's character in the film Boys Don't Cry, Jack shows how this film hijacks the male and female gazers to replace them with queer forms of visual pleasure. And I mention this here, not only because this concept has been really helpful for my own research and teaching, but really because it represents just one of the many ways in which Jack has significantly influenced or been so influential across disciplines. Jack's work is often humorous and unserious. As he reminds us in his book, The Queer Art of Failure from 2011, being taken seriously means missing out on the chance to be frivolous, promiscuous, and irrelevant. Characteristically for Jack, this unseriousness is underpinned by an ethics of resistance, where resistance takes the form of counterintuitive and anti-capitalist modes of knowing, such as failure and stupidity. A refusal of mastery, as it's come to be defined. I find this personally very liberating, and I wonder whether there's something about the way that Jack draws on such wide-ranging texts of different registers, genres, modes, a kind of disciplinary promiscuity, or like a kind of, performance extraordinaire of the promiscuity or the promiscuous potential of the humanities. Whether there's something about this that makes it possible for us to find ways in to relate his writing to our own thinking and our own experiences. Jack's most recent writing has turned to the wild, to the art of wildness and the space of disorder. His book, Wild Things from 2020, offers an alternative history of sexuality in the 20th century. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, it feels like risky business to take up a term that has so forcefully been weaponized against those considered sexually and racially deviant. But for Jack, it's precisely the centrality of this concept that opens it up for us. He offers a sprawling anarchive of the unrecoverable, the lost, the illegible. As he says, a genealogy of the violence that has expelled wild things from the world. This is a decolonial and celebratory book that asks us in its concluding pages to move towards bewilderment, to give ourselves to the wild and the feral. This talk today is part of Jack's ongoing engagement with disorder and queerness, with a focus now on the architectural. For this research, Jack was awarded the Arcus Prize that recognizes innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment, as well as a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2024. So it is, as you all know, marking and dissertation season right now. And in the run-up to this talk, I've been struck by how many of my excellent students at undergraduate and postgraduate level are citing your work, Jack, to make sense of wide-ranging topics in literature, culture, sociology, film, history, politics. And it's not only because my colleagues and I have set you as set reading, because we're fans, we are fans, but it's because you give language to ideas and concepts that were previously without contour, turning experience into articulations. In this present moment here in the UK, I'm especially grateful to you for being here. As I reread part of Jack's 1998 book on female masculinity, I was reminded of his words about the bathroom problem, which he describes as much more than a glitch in the machinery of gender segregation, and is much better described in terms of the violent enforcement of our current gender system. Right now, thinking with and about trans epistemologies, a thread throughout Jack's work, including today's talk, feels to me at least to be nothing short of life-giving. Jack is no stranger to this university. He sat on the advisory board for the Q+ network here, and in 2015 was visiting professor at the Center for Gender Studies whilst conducting research on wildness. So I'd ask you to please join me in welcoming Jack back for this lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic introduction, Layla, and I want to thank everybody who has been instrumental in bringing me here. I'm sorry that it's your exam period, but we're going to talk today about unbuilding and unmaking and taking things apart. And I would include in the scope of things that have to come undone the university. So we can, we can definitely think about what has got to go there. So we are in a really terrible and weird political moment. I mean, I really don't have to unpack that for you. But part of our problem is that we don't really know how to resist it. And in order to come up with new ways of proposing alternatives to basically authoritarian capitalism waged against us by the super rich, I want to propose to you tonight, and you'll decide whether this works for you, that we should be using a really different language than the language of resistance that we've inherited from earlier generations. So we tend to think in terms of rights and recognition from the state and the right to be something or to do something. You can see, based upon recent Supreme Court rulings here in the UK, that those rights are only as good as your leaders. And recognition from states that we do not believe in, from governments who do not have our interests in mind, are not the way forward. So therefore, I'm going to offer you a language from the 1970s and from a really fascinating art movement whose core principles emerged out of anarchy. And I think there's never been a better moment to think about anarchy, that it's very clear that the state and capital collude in the production of carceral systems that benefit very, very few people. So what alternatives are there out there, and how might we craft languages of resistance that are up to the task of dismantling this terrible conjuncture that we find ourselves in? Okay, so that's the question. The slide that you see up there, I don't want to ignore it, is a beautiful image by Jessie Darling, who is a British artist who's interested in the gendered body. And we're going to come all the way back around to that image by the end of the talk and think about how an image like this is called Gravity's Road, and it conjures the name of the first roller coaster. But this is very clearly a roller coaster you could not ride on without it collapsing. So what is it about this language of loopiness and collapsing, dismantling and undoing? Why might we pay attention to it again now? And this is a language that I'm going to pull forward from the 1970s. So for those of you who don't know what anarchitecture is, let me begin by giving you a brief sort of biography of the term, the movement, and its main practitioner. So you could probably figure out what anarchitecture means just from putting together architecture and anarchy. Architecture is the main modality of actually the systems of power that we currently inhabit. We live in built environments that contain us. We live in systems that are oriented through real estate. We believe in subjectivities that are definitively tied to property. In the 1970s, people were less sure about the relationship between property, subjectivity, individuality, and architecture. And into all of these European and American cities that World War II was struggling financially, and many of which were falling down, came all of these anarchist movements. People were squatting, people were engaging in art movements in buildings that had been abandoned. And there was not at all a sense that we just want to work up towards recognition from the state. So I want to pull forward this idea of anarchy and think about what promise it holds, especially for queer and trans people. So this is the guy who really stands out as the main practitioner of anarchitecture from the 1970s. His name's Gordon Matta-Clark. He was a American Chilean artist, and this is a great story for grad students. He went off to grad school in the 1960s. He lived in New York City with his mom and his twin brother. He went off to grad school in the 1960s to study architecture at Cornell. And Cornell was really happening at that time. Robert Smithson, Peter Eisenman, there were many artists and architects in residence there, and he had a great time. He learned to be an architect. So then he comes back to New York City and he throws all of that training out of the window and decides that his mission is not to build a new city, but to unbuild everything. So that's what we're going to work with here. He was part of a collective. It wasn't just him. And I think that's an important piece of the story. But it's his practice and his cuts and his splits that he makes to various kinds of structures that now round out the definition of anarchitecture. Now, I discovered this work by going to a retrospective, and at first I was just like, I don't get it. No, this is not for me. And then I spent the whole day at this museum up in the Bronx. And by the time I left, I was thoroughly convinced that the language of splitting and cutting and unmaking and undoing and dismantling and tearing down and collapse was exactly the language that we need, and was the language that at that moment kept real estate capital at bay, because it was interested not in building things, but in abandonment and finding out what was possible in the city, in these spaces that local government and the state and the government had abandoned. In abandoned spaces, there is opportunity. And you know now what is meant by real estate capital, because we all live in the world that real estate capital began to build in the 1970s and has now become mandatory, right? So everyone's supposed to own something. What does that mean? It means you owe a lot of money to the bank. Every city is lousy with massive luxury buildings that the wealthy have invested in but don't live in, right? That's what real estate capital is. Someone like Matta-Clark could see this coming and began to make very creative cuts into his environment to try to call attention to this coming conjuncture and an alternative to it. Now, this is super interesting for me, actually, from the standpoint of queer theory as well, because queer theory over the last 2 decades has made its investment in world building. And many people writing their dissertations and end of term papers may be super tempted to use that term that was really developed by Sedgwick and then taken up by her student, Jose Munoz, and it became a really inspirational term. But world building is also a colonial term, and it's a term that we should be now deeply suspicious of. This is not the 90s. This is not the moment of utopian thinking. This is a moment when we are inheriting a lousy world, and we have to figure out how to destroy it, okay? That's where Matta-Clark comes in. And by the way, this was a straight dude. He's not a gay man. And just if you were wondering, and in fact, my story will not run neatly through a story of good gays and bad straight people. The antagonist in my story is a gay man and an architect. So that's just a gesture to where we're going. The other thing you need to know about Matta-Clark is he lived a very short life. So he came back to New York City from Cornell in the 1970s. He began unmaking these buildings. And then in 1978, he died of pancreatic cancer. His work was religiously maintained and archived and collected by his widow, who still keeps his archive alive. But in recent years, people have returned to this work, and it's sort of everywhere. So what I'm doing with it, however, is different from what people are doing with it in architecture school. Matta-Clark also had these sort of aphoristic statements that he would write down on note cards. Remember, this is the 1970s. No one has a phone. People are not archiving digitally. They write on note cards, and those note cards are collected in archives. And they're really fun to go and look at all of these writings that he made. So you can hear in these little aphoristic sayings what is at stake in anarchitecture. He said, what really excites me is the undoing. So what I'm trying to call your attention to, and what I try to do in this book, is pull forward from anarchitecture this new political language. So there's one piece of it, undoing, undoing. Here's another one of his phrases, no thing works. Now, in the 1970s, New York was bankrupt. There were rolling blackouts. A lot of people would have said nothing works in New York City at that time. But that's not what Matta-Clark meant. Matta-Clark, who makes cuts into space, introduces voids and vacancies into places where there are something and masonry. For him, nothing does something. So nothing has a kind of value, a negative value, yes, but a value that we should pay attention to, especially in a capitalist world organized around very rich and very expensive somethings, right? So if something is the commodity, then nothing is a different kind of value, a different system. If anyone's ever seen WALL-E, have you seen WALL-E? Yeah. Remember, he finds the little box with the diamond ring and he throws out the diamond ring and keeps the box. That's equivalent to nothing works. Form follows function is a refusal of the modernist idea that form and function are tethered together. Instead, he suggests that form should get rid of function. So we can start thinking about what that might mean. What if you made things that dispensed with or got in the way of function? You would be disrupting, in fact, some of the mechanisms of capitalism, production, industry, and so on. And then finally, and this is a rebuff to people like Le Corbusier, the main sort of architectural theorist of the 30s and 40s. And he lived a long life. He continued to be influential into the 70s. And Le Corbusier's phrase was in the 1930s, when there were all of these mass movements and fascism was on the move, Le Corbusier said, there are two options, architecture or revolution. Le Corbusier chose architecture, okay? Matta-Clark chooses revolution. And against a Le Corbusier project that says, let's manage complex social units through architecture, Matta-Clark says, anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem. Why would you say that? Because in any given city, there are certain people who occupy the position of the problem that architecture comes to solve. Mostly poor people, often people of color. But the resolution that architecture offers doesn't do anything for those people. So anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem. All right. So that we can get a sense of what anarchitecture actually looks like, I'm going to give you, here are 3 examples of modernist buildings on the left and a Matta-Clark work on the right, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. That house on the left is a glass house, is made by Philip Johnson. He's going to be our antagonist tonight, and we'll come back around to him. Philip Johnson began his architecture work in the 1930s, and post-war, he built this beautiful glass house in Connecticut that you can still go and visit today. But it wasn't actually his idea. It was Mies van der Rohe's idea. Mies van der Rohe was a German architect who liked to tell the story that he fled the Nazis, but in fact, he just wasn't getting enough commissions from the Nazi government, and he took Philip Johnson's invitation to come to the US, where there were more possibilities for making money. Mies van der Rohe, you'll recall, his slogan is less is more. I would say that's bullshit. Not much about Mies van der Rohe or Philip Johnson adheres to that principle that less is more. And together they made this very famous building in New York City called the Seagram Tower. that began a tradition of building huge glass phallic entities in the middle of super cities by moving out all of the people who lived in those areas and making that area only into sort of corporate land. And that's Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. And they, in many ways, are the versions of architecture that Matta-Clark comes to repudiate. So let's look at splitting. Oh, well, let's think about what architecture is. And I don't know if I have another image of that house. So let me go back to it. No, I don't. So let's go to this one. So this is one of Matta-Clark's most famous works. It's called Splitting. He made it in 1974 when his gallerist said she had bought some property in New Jersey, because that's what white people were doing at that time. White people were fleeing the city. They were given very nice mortgages in the post-war years. People of color were not given the same kind of mortgage opportunities. So places that previously had been lived in by people of color, those people were now moved out. White people moved in, got rid of the houses that those people were living in, and built these new suburban communities. All of that is happening in this area. So Matta-Clark says, before you remove that property, which was formerly owned by an African-American family, can I make a work of it? She said, yes. He went there with a sawzall and a chainsaw, and he introduced a split into the building. Now, I want to call your attention to this because I want us to understand what the work is. Okay, the work is not the house that has been split. The work is the split. It's that V shape in the middle. It's the void. His work, remember, is excited by the undoing. His work is to introduce a void where there is something, right? To call attention, if you like, to the property regime, which is, after all, a speculative scam in which we build roofs and walls around empty space and then say, this will be $1 million, this will be 500,000 pounds, whatever it may be. So that split is a reminder that also the house is nothing. The house is that empty space. Rachel Whiteread, actually in the UK, did something very similar in a much reviled work called House in 1993, where she created a concrete block out of the centerpiece of a house that was set to be demolished. So people were thinking about these real estate problems in relationship to this kind of gesture, okay? So splitting is the introduction of space. Now, in order to make that work, you actually do need some architectural know-how, because you can't just take a chainsaw and cut down the middle of a house. It will just simply fall in. So he had to dig out the foundation in the back so that when you introduce the cut, the house falls backwards. And when it falls backwards, it splits. It's actually a very complicated procedure. Taking things apart and destroying them requires a lot of skill. And it's a skill that apparently we don't have and we need. And so we're going to look at this artwork and these practices and these gestures and see what we can learn from it. Like most of Matta-Clark's work, this piece was demolished within days. Nothing remains. Nothing remains of just about any of his work. The inheritance of Matta-Clark, in other words, is nothing. And at one point, an interviewer said to him, but don't you want to leave like a little something? Like, what if a museum wants to collect a piece of your work? And Matta-Clark was like, yeah, no, I don't want a museum to collect a piece of my work. If a museum is interested in my work, they should invite me, and I will come and put a split in the middle of that museum, right? That is the gesture, and you have to accept the gesture, not try to take something out of the nothing that has been offered, okay? So this gesture is what we're calling anarchitecture. And there are many other examples. I'll give you another example later on. But what I'm going to do is try to pull a queer aesthetic out of anarchitecture and see where it takes us. So basically, anarchitecture as a political project is refusing the emphasis in the 1970s on urban improvement. Urban renewal is what it was called. Urban renewal meant let's move people of color out and poor people out, and let's build swanky new buildings that will appreciate over time. It's the beginning of speculative capitalism that is invested in the home. The home, not as a place you live in, but the home as currency that will hide your money, hold your money, and appreciate over time. That's what we mean by gentrification. There's Mies van der Rohe. Matta-Clark says, while most architects seek to bring a building into existence, I rely upon existing buildings. I seek to complement and amplify the meaning of a specific space by metamorphic cutting or voiding that space. Now, that notion of metamorphic cutting is a beautiful invitation to think with Anarchitecture about the trans body, because the trans body isn't simply a body that evolves and morphs and becomes male or female. A trans body is produced through metamorphic cutting. You do a top surgery on a trans man, you do a bottom surgery, you're cutting into the body, and through these splits and voids and vacancies, you are creating a nothing out of something. And in the process, you are bringing the binary gender system to the point of collapse. So this book pulls this language of Anarchitecture forward and uses it to describe the trans body outside of the language of rights and recognition. And we'll return to that as we go. Okay, the final cut, just to say, and I don't do this too well in the book, but I do believe that the final cut in relationship to Anarchitecture has to be to remove Matta-Clark himself from the project and allow this language of Anarchitecture to become available for other projects, because we do not need another art history of a charismatic guy who is so brilliant and such a genius. And I'm sort of contributing to that. I do love this guy's work, you know, but I believe as an anarchist, he did not want to be the proper name behind Anarchitecture. So the final cut is to take this language and do other things with it. And I believe that that is properly honoring the archive that he leaves behind, the archive of nothing. All right, so I've teased a couple of times that there are implications for queer studies and queer history in this narrative about splitting and undoing and unmaking. So I'm gonna, I just will do this sort of quickly so we can get to more of the artwork from the 1970s that basically exemplifies this argument. But I'm gonna argue here for an anarchitectural approach to queer history. Now, one of the stories that we've told about queer communities is that queer people really began to emerge, or at least gay men began to emerge as a subculture at the beginning of the 20th century, says John D'Amelio, when wage labor becomes common. Because when you make a wage, you, queer person, can now ditch your family and buy yourself some independence. And it wasn't until that moment that people were able to avail themselves of wage labor that gay subcultures appear in the city. And John D'Amelio makes this argument in Capitalism and Gay Identity. Now, what I want to say in response to D'Amelio, however, many years after he crafts this argument, is this actually presents a problem for us, because there's a way in which queerness now depends upon capitalism and is tethered to capitalism in ways that we can now all track and trace. We can see in the gay pride parades. We can see it in the quest for pink dollars. We can see it in the way in which neoliberal capital sought until very recently to include gay men and lesbians in the money-making enterprise. So what we need as well is a critique of this connection between capitalism and queerness. Just to give you an example of the way in which capital and queerness can be intertwined in ways that are problematic, Linda Good Bryant in 1993 made a film that very few people saw. Has anyone ever seen Flag Wars? Thank you. Excellent. Two of us. Flag Wars was a really amazing documentary. Linda Good Bryant was actually a Black gallerist who in the 1970s created art galleries where people of color could show their work because people of color were not shown in the major institutions in global cities. In the 1990s, she turned her attention with Laura Poitras to the incursion into real estate that was being made by white gay men and lesbians. And she actually did a close study of a small town in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, a neighborhood that was a traditionally Black neighborhood into which white gays and lesbians had moved. Real estate agents brought their clients there, and within 2 or 3 years, that whole neighborhood of Black renters had been transformed into a white gay and lesbian enclave. And at least in the US, you can find these white gay and lesbian enclaves all over New Jersey and Connecticut and so on. And they are often part of this narrative about the way in which capitalism and LGBT community, in fact, thrive together. So against that, we want a different kind of queer history. Special effect there. And I'm borrowing a term from a young historian who very sadly killed himself after writing a spectacular dissertation. And this is Christopher Chitty. I really recommend this book to you. For anyone who's in the workshops that we're doing later on, we're going to read a piece by him. Christopher Chitty wrote a book called Sexual Hegemony, in which he argued for a deflationary queer history. And you can see, and deflationary, of course, is like the language of anarchitecture. It's also about pulling down this heroic narrative of those valiant gays and lesbians who do battle with the heteronormative system and are heroically positioned against it. Yes, that's sometimes true. But it's also the case that capitalism and gay identity have been linked in ways that we should pay more careful attention to. And I won't go into this here, but Chitty goes all the way back to 15th century Italy to make the argument that across the early modern period and into the contemporary period, the state decides what it needs from homosexuality and crafts a kind of hegemon out of a relationship to gay community. Just to give you the basics, in the 15th century, mostly sodomitic relations were between young men and older men. They were often encouraged. Why? Because young men would get information about political intrigue from the older men and sell it back to the state. Or the young men would help to bring the old men down if they were becoming too powerful. And according to Christopher Chitty, if you don't understand this about sodomitical relations, you cannot read Machiavelli's The Prince, because it's all about sodomy. So for anyone working with a political theory and interested in introducing this kind of sodomitical history, there you go. But it's basically a history about the way in which relations between men in particular are deeply useful to the state at certain moments. So you get this idea of hegemony. And I want to give you an example of a deflationary queer history. So here's Exhibit A. On the right is the despicable Roy Cohn, one of the great villains of gay history. Roy Cohn helped Senator McCarthy to prosecute hundreds and thousands of people for potentially being communists. Roy Cohn almost single-handedly put Ethel Rosenberg in the electric chair. And Roy Cohn makes this appearance in Angels in America as the gay man who refuses to say he's gay. Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's lawyer, and he helped Donald Trump to get his first big deal in New York City when he bought a hotel, and Roy Cohn bribed the state officials so that Trump never had to pay the $14 million in taxes on that purchase. And this at a time when New York City was bankrupt. So there are deflationary stories to be told. And this is to set up the deflationary story about gay architecture that I'm going to tell, okay? Here's another deflationary figure, for me at least, Andy Warhol, who also had Roy Cohn as his lawyer, amazingly, and who was really the artist who said, why are art and commerce opposed? Why don't we bring them together? So there's that capitalism meets gay identity again. And I think there are other stories to tell about Andy Warhol than the ones that we have favored. This is a picture of Andy Warhol, also with Donald Trump, because in the 1980s, he desperately wanted Donald Trump to buy a silkscreen of a hideous silkscreen he'd made of Trump Tower. And even Donald Trump was like, yeah, I'm not buying that. That's really ugly. Too bad, Andy. But Andy was already in his phase where he was running Interview magazine and had become really quite a conservative figure. So in this turn to sexual hegemony, we have to think differently about the way in which gay and lesbian actors play roles in capitalism. And this is often divided up by race and by class. And so the narratives that we've told are very often sort of dishonest narratives. And then they lead to this kind of world building, gay marriage, rights and recognition result. Opposing that kind of history, however, at the very same time that, Roy Cohn was helping Trump out, in 1973, the anarchist activist Sylvia Rivera forced her way onto the stage at the Christopher Day parade, dressed in this sparkly one-piece pantsuit, and said that she wanted to come up on the stage because she wanted to speak for her brothers and sisters who are in jail. And she said, I've been here all day and no one has spoken about queer and trans people who are in jail. And she said, and when those folks are released from jail, they don't come to you and your organizations because you don't care about them. But I have an organization and they come to me. And her organization was called STAR, Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. And this was a very, very strong movement in the 1970s. You could say that it's way more important than Stonewall. And sometimes people blur Stonewall by saying Sylvia Rivera was the one who began the Stonewall Revolution. But honestly, if I had a penny for every person who was supposed to have started the Stonewall Revolution, my particular opinion is forget about Stonewall. That's not where the action is. That was a mafia club. There were many, many places, and I'm going to introduce you to one of them, where people were actively and radically trying to take that society apart. So there are the street transvestites. And this is what Rivera said. The people are trying to do something for all of us and not men and women that belong to a white middle-class white club. And that's what you all belong to. So I'm not manufacturing that split. This is a real split in the 1970s. It's there in Born in Flames. There are many different films that depict this. All right, so let's take this deflationary history seriously then. And I'm just going to do this quite quickly so that we can move towards a conclusion. Here's a beautiful image of another work by Gordon Matta-Clark, which is called Day's End. And Day's End was a massive sail-shaped cut that Matta-Clark made into the West Side piers. Now, in New York City in the 1970s, the piers that had once been the hub of a busy shipping industry had been abandoned. The shipping industry was over. It was the age of jet plane travel. And when those warehouses fell empty, gay men began to cruise there, drug dealers began to deal there, homeless people began to live there. And this is where you should look for your Stonewall, right, is in the piers. And there was a really amazing photographer, Alvin Baltrop, who took the most gorgeous photographs of the piers. Now, he's mostly been written about within this paradigm of gay male sex, and he's seen as one of the great documenters of gay male cruising in the piers. But when I look at his photographs, what I see is an anarchitectural photograph in which what's being foregrounded is collapse itself. Yes, there are gay men there, naked sunbathers, but in many of his images, the whole drama is focused upon the piers themselves. And there we see a kind of an enactment aesthetically of this anarchitectural language that I'm referring to. And he and Matta-Clark cross paths because he's taking pictures as Matta-Clark is cutting this beautiful shape into the side of the piers. So Matta-Clark cut the sail, and then inside the pier, he cut a hole into the floor so the light would come in and it would bounce all around the warehouse. It was a really beautiful piece. In Pier 52, it lasted another year, and then the gentrifiers took the whole thing down. Now, at the time, or when people started writing about Alvin Baltrop, which was not really until the early 2000s, they pitched him against Matta-Clark. They said Matta-Clark was an interloper, he's a straight guy, why is he even in the piers? But as we see from this photograph, the two artists were actually working along the same principles. They were interested in the same geometries. They were using the same language. This is a photograph of a Matta-Clark piece, so it doesn't make sense to pitch them against each other in that way. Here's another piece, and I'm looking at these photographs thinking, sure, they may well be about gay male cruising, but they are also about this sort of entropic motion in the city in which buildings are falling down in this very beautiful sort of tumbling way. And this one is actually called collapsed architecture. Here's another one that really gets at the dereliction of New York City in that time period. And that's, as much as anything, what Alvin Baltrop is photographing. So if we see it from a kind of queer of color perspective and recognize that he is documenting this site of dereliction, not just the white gay male bodies who are cruising there, then we are thinking differently about queer history, queer sex, and so on. Here's another one that brings together danger. The piers were often on fire, it turns out, because people were living there and doing drugs and so on. For Douglas Crimp, however, he thought about these piers as an open-air sex club. And I'm a little bit critical of Crimp in this book, but at the same time, Crimp is the person who really brought Baltrop's photographs to the fore. No one would give Baltrop a show in his lifetime. He was turned away from gallery after gallery. And this was in an era when Robert Mapplethorpe was being censored, but his work was being shown. And those were really different photographs. You remember these tidy interiors with gay men, often in S&M arrangements of bodies. These images, often with bodies as just little specks, could not be shown in that same period. And there's a Robert Mapplethorpe. This is what the art world thrilled to. Baltrop found absolutely zero market for his work and eventually just gave up. And it wasn't until he was already dying of cancer some 25 years later that he finally had a show curated by Douglas Crimp. And here's one final image. So this is to say we can look for this language in many different places, and that we want to move away always from thinking about the charisma of sex and also think about the built environment, its dereliction, and the kind of crumpling, folding down, entropic decline that these places represent in these photographs. When he does show you gay men having sex, this is the kind of image that we get. There are two men having sex in there. If you look through the girders, this one is actually just called blowjob. But of course, it's really sexy for the obstacle placed in front of it. So that there's a kind of erotic sensibility that is created by the placing of human bodies at scale within this collapsing warehouse. That's what the imagery is about. All right, I'm not, let's just pass over that other than to say, This represents the art world. The art world is interested in the ever erect, ever ready, pneumatic, perfectly puppied, balloon-like structures that these Jeff Koons sculptures are outside of every Guggenheim museum around the world. They're repulsive. But that literally represents the art commodity. And against that, you can see how Baltrop could find no quarter for his work, which was not seen as beautiful or interesting. And it was placed at odds with the shiny city that urban renewal came to make. There are girls in this narrative, and I would just point you to this fabulous movie, again, a lost queer movie, Times Square. Has anyone seen Times Square? Nope, the greatest lesbian film no one's ever seen, in which two girls go on the run to a soundtrack provided by Patti Smith and the Ramones and so on. And in a rapidly gentrifying New York City, they make their way to the piers. And this is one of the only movies ever shot in the piers that Baltrop was photographing. And they make a home there and form a punk band and then go around the city destroying televisions. Television was the target. If you can, remember back to the 1970s and 80s, everyone was like, kill your TV. Right now, we're like so hooked into every single kind of screen, we can no longer imagine this kind of rebellion. But it's a great film. If there's time later, I'll show you the clip from it. All right. So let me get into my penultimate section then, before we return to Jesse Darling. So I told you there's an antagonist. There's I don't know why that keeps popping up. There we go. There's an antagonist in this narrative. And I think the antagonist is important for us to try to understand what an architecture comes to oppose. So I want to tell you about this guy. And you remember the glass house from some 40 minutes ago. This is Philip Johnson. And Philip Johnson is doing the kind of architecture that anarchitecture opposes, okay? I'll give you Philip Johnson's biography, and then I'm going to tell you about a very brief meeting between Philip Johnson and Gordon Matta-Clark. So Philip Johnson went to Harvard in the 1930s. He was not studying architecture, but he was a very wealthy man, and he met another very wealthy man who said, I'm going to start a museum of modern art in New York, which became MoMA. Would you like to be the architecture director? Philip Johnson, who's never studied architecture, says yes. Why yes? I will come with you to New York, and I will be the architecture director. He then put on a show that was called The International Style. And the International Style literally became the mode of architecture that most global cities used from then on, and that has shaped the cities that we live in. This guy with no architectural training, but that's not the antagonism of Philip Johnson. So as the war begins, in the middle of the 1930s, Philip Johnson becomes fabulously wealthy from the war because his father had given him stocks in aluminium. And aluminium was super important to building armaments. So he becomes amazingly wealthy. He goes touring Europe and buying up modern art all over the place, which has become, by the way, the permanent collection of MoMA. But on one trip, he happens upon a Nazi parade in Germany, either in Nuremberg or in Berlin. And he's like, what's this? This is fabulous. He's so excited by the blonde boys in their beautiful uniforms. But it wasn't just an aesthetic interest. He came back to the US and he dropped out of MoMA and tried to begin an American fascist party, styling himself as the Führer, okay? He wrote not one, but 2 reviews of Mein Kampf and was really sure that fascism could catch on in the US. And he was not wrong about that. He was just a little bit out of sync with the timing of it. So he's very, very invested in fascism. And then he sort of loses interest a little bit. He sees how the war is going. And he's like, I'm gonna go to Harvard and study architecture. By that point, the FBI has a file on him, as you would hope it does, but he spent not one day being interrogated. He spent not 1 minute in prison, okay? And remember, Ethel Rosenberg died in 1953 in the electric chair on the assumption that she may have known something about her husband passing secrets to the Russians. Secrets to the Russians. The Russians were the American ally during World War II. Philip Johnson was considered during World War II to be a spy for the Nazis and was labeled as such. He suffered no consequences from that and went on to become one of the most significant architects of the 20th century, building the New York skyline. And it is that version of architecture that is deeply located in fascism and that was never suppressed post-World War II, but in fact was encouraged, that anarchitecture understands itself to be pitched against, if that makes sense. Here's his Seagram Tower with Mies van der Rohe. They had a little bromance, these two. Mies van der Rohe designed Philip Johnson's New York apartment, and as I said, he helped Mies van der Rohe get out of Nazi Germany, crafting this narrative for him that he was being persecuted by the Nazis. Zero evidence that was true. And here's our friend Andy, who was a frequent visitor at the Glass House. And I say this only because Philip Johnson was at the very center of a large circle of white gay artists of that time, all of whom must have known about this wartime activity. And as I said, this is not a casual interest, and yet it did not at all seem to harm his reputation or break up his circle of friends. Okay. In that glass house, you will have seen, I'll show it to you again, just to pull this around to a conclusion. In the background of the glass house, that is a completely transparent house in that modernist mode. And in the back, there's this circular chimney. And when Philip Johnson was asked, why did he put this heavy-duty chimney in the middle of a glass house, people have conjectured that he did so to remind himself of a scene he had seen in Europe when, at the invitation of Hitler, he had marched into Poland with the German Wehrmacht. He continued, says Nikhil Saville, to make veiled, possibly unconscious references to his past and his architecture. Describing the inspirations that produced his glass house, he suggested rather disturbingly that the idea of an illuminated house at night came from a burnt wooden village I saw once where nothing was left but foundations and chimney of brick. Lamster, his biography, plausibly wonders whether he intentionally recreated what he called in a letter to a friend the stirring spectacle that was the burning of Jewish devils that he had witnessed driving into Poland with the Wehrmacht. So thousands of visitors go and visit this glass house every day. Nobody is given that history. And Johnson tried very hard in the period following World War II to cover this up. He collected Jewish artists. He built buildings in Israel, but he also, to the day he died, professed his great admiration for fascist architects like Albert Speer. Just saying. Okay, this final chapter then of a standoff between Gordon Matta-Clark and Philip Johnson. So in 1976, Matta-Clark was invited by his mentor to do a piece for a show that was being held in a fancy architectural institute in Midtown Manhattan. Matta-Clark said, great, I have some photographs of broken windows in the Bronx, I'll hang them, but could I shoot out one window in the gallery for effect? They're like, no, you cannot. It's like, okay, so he goes to the gallery, and this was a show being put on by his former mentor, Peter Eisenman. And he goes to the gallery, he hangs his photographs, and he shoots out every window in the gallery. So he and his wife go off, and they come back the next day, and Matta-Clark is handed his photographs in a brown paper bag. And every window in the gallery has been replaced overnight, which in New York City at that time was a miracle. When they asked who had replaced the windows, they were told, Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was the president of this institute. And I say this is a very, it's a banal, non-meeting between the two. But I do so to say the anarchist who breaks things, has one kind of political project. And the fascist who wants to mend things and repair things has another. And this maybe throws into bold relief why we might be more interested in breaking than repairing. Okay, I have more to say about Philip Eisenman, but I won't. Peter Eisenman. Okay, we've come full circle. I'm just going to conclude then with a final piece of anarchitectural art. Throughout the book, I turn to pieces of sculpture made by trans artists like Jessie Darling, who don't even like the terminology of trans artists, but who are working with an anarchitectural vocabulary. So as I said, Gravity's Road is about a roller coaster that can only fall down. And Jessie Darling tells the story of building this piece in a gallery that was formerly home to a swimming pool that had been built by the Third Reich. So this show opened in Germany, and he understood it as a rebuke to a kind of fascist emphasis on the beautiful body and the healthy and pure body. And he creates lots of images like this that are both interested in the loopiness of the trans body, its instability, its fragility and precarity. But he's also making connections, I would say, in his work to disability. And this was part of his No Medals, No Ribbons show that was part of what had him awarded the Turner Prize. So let me just conclude with one paragraph then. You can just bear with me for 1 minute longer. So we've been thinking then about collapse, about unworlds, about dismantling, undoing. We've been talking about entropy. And entropy is basically the second law of thermodynamics, according to which the total entropy of a system either increases or remains constant in any spontaneous process. It never decreases. In other words, heat cannot travel from a cold body to a warmer one. Order cannot resolve brokenness. Entropy or disorder increases over time. So the natural order of things is towards entropy, yeah. If you fall and break, you cannot be put back together the way you were. Worlds break, Jessie Darling's work tells us, and through his wobbly shapes of bodily infirmity, we see why we have to resist the urge to put everything back together, to pull shards into passable shapes, to form facsimiles of unbroken life. Instead, these installations lead us into the break itself and ask us to find a spot among the loopy steel rails, the fallen figures, the debris, and the junk. Once you're in the heart of a collapsing structure, you will see that the future is not ours. We cannot take it, dream it, buy it, or occupy it. It is now, it is here, and it is over. Thank you.